I want to talk to you about suicide. It is a serious public health concern. Every year, over 800,000 people around the world die by suicide. And in the United States alone, there's more than 1.4 million suicide attempts that occur every year. This is 2 suicide attempts every minute. I did the math, and I couldn't believe this. So this is a problem. Now, the clinical decision predicting suicide is really challenging. The clinical decision is about balancing out risk factors and protective factors, such as previous trauma, bullying, social support, which is a protective factor, and like social isolation or financial or personal loss. And this clinical decision is very subjective, and it could be a very imperfect process. Also, patients, self-assessments made by patients could also be misleading. So predicting suicide can be very difficult. Now, way much later in my life in college, I learned that the environment could influence the brain, and then our brain shapes behavior. And our brain is constantly active with our environment. And so a lot of these risk factors and protective factors have real concrete biological connections to the brain. As a neuroscientist, I aim to examine these biological characteristics that could be associated with risk for suicidal behavior. So in our lab, we use neuroimaging to both scan and look at research participant brains. And this is actually a picture of my brain during one of our practice scans. And specifically with magnetic resonance imaging, we are able to look at the structural, physical parts of the brain. And with that, we could try to see if the structural differences affect some of the functional impairments that we see in cognitive decisions and reasoning, mood impairments, and emotional dysregulations that are associated with suicidal risk. We first wanted to see differences in individuals who've had previous suicide attempts and compared to those individuals who've only had suicidal thoughts but did not have previous suicide attempts. Now, we found differences in the thalamus of previous suicide attempts. And this region is very centrally located in the brain, and it has many different connections to many different parts of the brain. And it serves to relay sensory and movement information. And it also sends information to the limbic region, which we all know that is part of the emotion regulation and memory. And it also sends information to the frontal part of the brain, which is more for our cognitive reasoning and decision making and impulse control. We also found differences in the nucleus accumbens, and this region is kind of a critical part in the reward pathway, and it has functions for both reward and avoidant behaviors, and it also forms both positive and negative memories. Okay. So then we really wanted to see differences in individuals who've had previous suicide attempts versus acute suicide risk. So we compared individuals with both previous suicide attempts for more than 6 months ago and compared them to individuals who've had suicide attempts within the past 3 days. We found differences in the hippocampus. And now this region is very sensitive to acute changes in our environment. And this region is also very interactive with the limbic region and frontal areas. And other studies have shown that recent negative and stressful life events are closely tied to suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So now we know that by looking into the living brain, we can look at the suicidal mind in a more objective and deeper understanding. And my next aim of this, the goal is to look at the functional kind of processes I mentioned before with emotion and cognitive impairments, kind of map that onto the structural differences that we see. I'm excited to continue collaborating with other physicians and patients and researchers to really have an integrative understanding of the suicidal brain. And with more understanding, I think that it's very encouraging that we could find quickly advance suicide intervention for prevention of suicide. Thank you.